Good morning. All right. My name is Ray Nelson, and I'm a senior sociology and anthropology major. And today's convocation speaker is sponsored by the Office of Intercultural and International Life, is Michelle Alexander. The first time I heard Professor Alexander speak was at the White Privilege Conference last year in Minneapolis. At that time, I had not known anything about the injustice of mass incarceration. But after she spoke at the conference, my mind was blown away. For me, her presentation had made the issue of incarceration quite clear. As a result, her words inspired my peers and myself to organize the Black Student Alliance's Prison Reform Week that recently took place. It is this type of awareness that is critical if we are ever to solve this major societal issue. For that, I would like to say thank you to Professor Alexander. Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar who currently holds a joint appointment at the Kirwan Institute for the study of race, ethnicity, at the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. Prior to joining the Kirwan Institute, Professor Alexander was an associate professor of law at Stanford Law School, where she directed the Civil Rights Clinic. In 2005, she won a Soros Justice Fellowship, which supported the writing of her first book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The book is considered one of the top African-American books of 2010, and it won the NAACP Image Award for outstanding literary work of nonfiction. The book has been featured on national radio and television media outlets, including NPR, the Bill Mayer's Journal, the Tavis Smiley Show, C-SPAN Washington Journal, amongst others. Alexander's current work reflects lessons learned in her previous career as a civil rights lawyer and advocate in both the private and non-profit sector. For several years, Alexander served as the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU of Northern California, where she helped to lead a national campaign against racial profiling by law enforcement. While an associate at Saperstein, Goldstein, Demchak, and Baller, she specialized in plaintiff-side class action lawsuits alleging race and gender discrimination. Alexander is a graduate of Stanford Law School and Vanderbilt University. Following law school, she clerked for Justice Harry A. Blackmun on the United States Supreme Court and for Chief Justice Abner Mikva on the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Michelle Alexander will be signing copies of her book at the table near the stage immediately following the convocation. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Alexander to Carleton College.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's just an honor to be here at Carleton College and joining you all in your celebration of Black History Month. I have to confess that I've come to have mixed feelings about Black History Month over the years. Every year as February rolls around, we begin to hear the same sound bites of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, often recycled on the radio, sound bites that, in my view, offer a fairly watered-down version of the history of the struggle and the truth that Dr. King preached in his life. And typically in February, I attend Martin Luther King Jr. honors and Black History Month gatherings in which we are reminded of the historic struggles for racial justice, the challenges that were overcome, and the incredible victories. And we're encouraged to remember we have a Black president of the United States today. We've come so far. And then towards the end, there's a reminder, well, of course, we still have a long way to go. Well, I'm not going to do that today. I want to dedicate this talk to the memory of Martin Luther King Jr., but in doing so, I'm going to try to heed the advice he gave in just months before his death, when he said, quote, I do not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it and a willing search for the truth and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it. So in Dr. King's honor today, I'm going to do my best to tell the truth about race in America, the whole truth. It's a truth that many Americans will deny, just as they were willing to deny or avoid knowing the truth about slavery and Jim Crow. But the truth is this: we as a nation have taken a wrong turn in our stride toward freedom. We betrayed Dr. King's dream. A vast new racial undercaste now exists in America, though their plight is rarely mentioned on the evening news. Obama won't mention it. The Tea Party won't mention it. Media pundits would rather talk about anything else. The members of the undercaste are now largely invisible to those of us who have jobs, live in decent neighborhoods, and zoom around on freeways past the virtual and literal prisons in which they live. They're part of the other America. In 1968, Dr. King gave a speech entitled "The Other America" at Grosse Pointe High School just months before his death. He said, quote, "There are two Americas. One America is beautiful. In this America, millions of people have the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality flowing before them. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, children grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But there is another America. This America has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair." He then went on to cite the inadequate, overcrowded, and fundamentally unequal schools. He described the high rates of unemployment in the black community. The official rate of black unemployment at that time was about 9%. But he noted that figure didn't include all those who had given up all hope of looking for work. He said the unemployment figures, quote, "do not take into consideration the thousands of people who have given up, who have lost motivation for work, the thousands of people who have had so many doors closed in their faces that they feel defeated and they no longer go out and look for jobs, the thousands who have come to feel that life is a long and desolate corridor with no exit signs. The vast majority of Negroes in America find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity." Well, on this day of all days, as we gather to reflect on our racial history, I think we owe Dr. King, as well as ourselves, an answer to this question: what really has changed? Most people of all colors today will say, so much has changed. They'll say, just look at all the black lawyers and black doctors. We're free now to eat in any restaurant, sit at any lunch counter. We're not relegated to the back of the bus. Just look at Oprah Winfrey. Just look at Barack Obama. Just look at Condoleezza Rice. Just look at Colin Powell. Until just recently, people were telling me, just look at Herman Cain. You know? We've come a long way. But then there's a pause and the familiar line, but of course we still have a long way to go. Now, this kind of talk and this familiar line implies that we're on the right path, that if we just keep plodding along, just keep applying ourselves in this direction, that we'll finally reach that promised land. But is that right? Are we truly on the right path? Are we still traveling the same road that Dr. King was at the end of his life? Or have we made a tragic detour, a U-turn? Could it be that we're heading right back to where we began? So many of the indicators of black well-being that Dr. King cited in his Other America speech are actually worse today than they were back then. Worse. Today, only 35% of black boys nationwide graduate from high school. The figure is 26% in New York City. Only 12% of black fourth-grade boys are proficient in reading, and shocking numbers are still not proficient in high school. Today, as in 1968, the reason for these shocking figures is not that black children lack native intelligence or the desire to learn. It's that their schools are so fundamentally inadequate and that hopelessness and despair pervades their communities, their families, and their lives. Dr. King complained that the official black unemployment rate in 1968 was 9%, with rates much higher if you count all those who are jobless but have given up looking for work. Well, today, in cities across America, more than 50% of black men are jobless. 50%. The Center for Economic Development at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee issued a report showing that 53.3% of working-age black men in Milwaukee are jobless, the highest ever recorded. In Detroit, the figure is 60%. Black unemployment rates have been breaking records nationwide, but with scarcely any notice. In December, last December, data released by the Community Service Society of New York showed that only 25% of young black men in New York City actually have a job. Now, I wish I could say that that's the worst of it, but it's not. I promise to do my best to tell the truth, the whole truth, and do it as directly as Dr. King once did, even when few Americans were willing to listen or wanted to hear it. So here it is. During the past 30 years, a vast new system of racial and social control has emerged from the ashes of slavery and Jim Crow. It's a system that would most certainly have Dr. King turning in his grave today. The systematic mass incarceration of poor people of color in the United States has emerged as a new caste system, one that shuttles children from decrepit, underfunded, unequal schools to brand new, well-funded, high-tech prisons. It's a system that locks poor people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, into a permanent second-class status nearly as effectively as earlier systems of racial and social control. Now, I admit that there was a time when I rejected this kind of talk. I rejected it out of hand. There was a time when I rejected comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery or mass incarceration and Jim Crow. I believe those were exaggerations, distortions, hyperbole. In fact, I thought people who made those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But what a difference a decade makes. For after years of working as a civil rights lawyer, representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality, and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people who had been released from prison re-enter into a society that had never shown much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I now call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that is so obvious to me now, that what seems odd in retrospect is that I could have been blind to it for so long. As I describe in the introduction to my book, The New Jim Crow, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. But like I said, I didn't come to this conclusion easily, I resisted it. I had a series of experiences that began to really spur my awakening, and one of them in particular, I'll never forget. It involved a young African-American man, probably about 19 years old, who walked into my office one day and forever changed the way I viewed not just the criminal justice system, but myself as a civil rights lawyer and advocate. At the time, I was directing the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU in California, and we had launched a major campaign against racial profiling by the police. We called it the DWB campaign, or the Driving While Black or Brown campaign. And we had sued the California Highway Patrol for racial profiling and their drug interdiction programs, and we were looking to sue some other police departments in California as well, departments that we had learned were engaging in discriminatory practices and tactics. And so we set up a hotline for people to call if they believed they had been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. And we put this hotline on billboards in Oakland and San Jose and in other communities. And within the first few minutes that our hotline number was announced on the evening news, we received thousands of calls. Our system crashed temporarily. We had to expand our capacity. And so I was spending my day interviewing one young black man after another who had been stopped, searched, frisked, often brutalized by the police for no apparent reason other than race. And this young man comes into my office carrying a stack of papers about this thick. He had taken detailed notes of his encounters with the Oakland Police Department over a 9-month period of time. He had descriptions of every encounter, he had names of officers, names of witnesses, in some cases even badge numbers. Just this extraordinary amount of detail and documentation of this pattern of police stops he had experienced in his community. And the stories he was telling me were corroborated by the other stories that we'd heard coming out of his neighborhood. And so I kind of began to get excited, asking him more questions, and I slowly became convinced that he might be the perfect plaintiff. To top it off, he was a good-looking young man. He was good-looking and well-spoken, and I started to think, here is our dream plaintiff. This is the one we've been looking for, who could be our named plaintiff in our suit against the Oakland Police Department's discriminatory tactics. And then he said something that made me stop. I said, did you just say you're a drug felon? Did you just say you're a drug felon? And he gets quiet and looks down, and then after a moment looks up and he says, yeah, I'm a drug felon, but listen, let me tell you what happened. The police planted drugs on me, and they beat up me and my friend. He starts telling me this long story about how he was framed by the police, and the police planted drugs on him and beat up him and his friend. And I just said, I'm sorry. I cannot represent you if you have a criminal record. We'd actually been screening people for criminal records. When people would call our hotline, we would send a form to them asking them a bunch of questions about their experiences with the police, and one of them was, have you ever been convicted of a felony? We weren't even interviewing people who had prior criminal histories because we believed we couldn't represent them without being attacked in the media. We knew that the media would say, well, of course law enforcement should be stopping, frisking, searching him. He's a drug felon. Of course they should be keeping their eye on him. And we knew we couldn't put someone with a felony record on the stand because they would inevitably be cross-examined in front of the jury about their prior criminal history, and their whole credibility would be challenged. And so I tried to explain to him, I'm sorry, there is just no way we can represent you if you have a criminal record. And he becomes frustrated, keeps trying to tell me about how he was framed and give me more information about that. And I just keep apologizing, trying to settle him down. And then he becomes enraged. And he says to me, you're no better than the police. You're no better than the police. The minute I tell you I'm a felon, you just stop listening. You can't even hear what I have to say. It's like, what's to become of me? What's to become of me? I can't get a job anywhere because of my felony record. I can't even get housing. It's like I have to sleep in my grandma's basement at night because nowhere else will take me in. I can't even get food food stamps. I can't even get food because of my drug felony. How am I supposed to take care of myself as a man? He says, good luck finding one young black man in my neighborhood that they haven't gotten to yet. They've gotten to us already. And he snatches those papers off the table, out of my hands, and just starts ripping them up to tiny little pieces, throwing them in the air. He walks out yelling at me, you're no better than the police. I can't believe I trusted you. You're no better than the police. He turns around and walks out, takes off. Well, several months after that, I'm doing a public access television show broadcasting live out of his neighborhood. I was doing public access television because we were trying to organize thousands of people to attend a protest at the state capitol, protesting the governor's failure to take action on racial profiling and sign racial profiling legislation. We've been holding town hall meetings up and down the state, doing a broad grassroots campaign, and it was just a couple days before the demonstration. So I was doing public access TV, trying to urge people to get on the bus and go to the state capitol for the demonstration. It's broadcasting live out of his neighborhood. As soon as the show ends, he comes bursting into the studio. He's carrying this dirty potted plant. And he rushes up to me, and he's emotional, practically on the verge of tears, and he says, I'm just here to tell you I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I shouldn't have treated you like that. I've been seeing you on TV. I see you're out there trying to fight for our people, trying to do the right thing, and I shouldn't have treated you like that. He said, I would have bought you some flowers, but I don't have any money. I snatched this plant off my grandma's front porch. Here. And he hands it to me, turns around, and goes running out of the building. I chase after him. He gets into this broke-down car and takes off. Well, several months after that, I'm in my office. I open up the newspaper. What's on the front page? Well, it turns out that the Oakland Writers police scandal has broken. There was a gang of officers, otherwise known as a drug task force, who had been planting drugs on suspects, beating folks up in his neighborhood, and who's identified as one of the main officers charged with planting drugs on suspects and beating folks up? The officer he had identified to me as having planted drugs on him and beat up him and his friend. And it was only then that the light bulb finally started to go on for me. And I realized, he's right about me. I'm no better than the police. The minute he told me he was a felon, I just stopped listening. I couldn't even hear what he had to say. And over time, I came to realize that my real crime wasn't in refusing to represent an innocent man. My real crime was in refusing to allow the voices we view as the guilty ones from ever being heard, from refusing to allow the stories of all those who have been labeled guilty and criminals from ever being told. And that was the beginning of my journey of doing an incredible amount of research, asking the question, why is it we haven't been able to find one young black man in his neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet? What is really going on here? And I started listening more carefully to the stories of those cycling in and out of our prison system. And what I learned in that process truly blew my mind. Here are a few of the facts I uncovered in the course of my work and research that I describe in the book. More African American adults are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. In 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws in many states accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. This is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. Now, contrary to the image presented in the media of black men being a bunch of deadbeat dads who just don't care much about their kids and would rather be doing something else than supporting them or caring for them, and contrary to the image in the media of black families just spontaneously disintegrating for reasons that kind of defy our imagination, the reality is that mass incarceration has decimated black families. And the research shows that black men who are separated from their children as a result of divorce, incarceration, or any other reason are actually more likely than men of any other racial or ethnic group to make efforts to maintain contact with their children following separation. It's not that black men don't care. It's that no other racial or ethnic group in America faces such extraordinary challenges to playing the role of a traditional father, a traditional parent. Now, this doesn't affect just some small segment of the African American community today. No, to the contrary, in many large urban areas today, more than half of working-age African American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In fact, in the Chicago area, it was reported that if you take into account prisoners, who are excluded, by the way, from poverty statistics and unemployment data, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States, but if you actually count prisoners as people, in the Chicago area, nearly 80% of working-age African-American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing caste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I'm sure that there's more than a few people who are thinking, what's she talking about? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if black folks would just stop running around committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven by crime and crime rates. It's not true. It's just not true. Over the past few decades, our prison population has quintupled, not doubled or tripled, but quintupled. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of even highly repressive regimes like Russia or China or Iran. The penal system we've constructed in the United States is unprecedented in world history. But again, this is not due simply to crime or crime rates. Over the past few decades, crime rates have fluctuated, have gone up, have gone down. Today, crime, as bad as it is in many parts of the country, is actually at historical lows. But incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime was going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what does explain this sudden, unprecedented explosion in incarceration of not crime and crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. I mean, just drug convictions alone accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison system and more than half of the increase in the state prison system between 1985 and 2000, the period of our prison system's most dramatic expansion. Drug convictions alone have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. I mean, to get a sense of how large a contribution the drug war has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people in prisons and jails today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. Not by accident, the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have now shown for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, or sell. Now that defies our basic racial stereotypes about who a drug dealer is. You know, picture a drug dealer in your mind. Who do you see? If you're like most Americans, you picture some black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging down. In fact, there was a study done in the 1990s, a national survey that asked people the question, close your eyes for a moment and imagine a drug criminal and describe him. 95% of respondents pictured an African American. Only 5% pictured someone of any other racial or ethnic group. So when we imagine a drug criminal, people imagine somebody who's black or brown. But drug use and abuse and drug dealing happens in every community of all colors. A white kid living in rural Minnesota, Kansas, doesn't drive to the hood to get their marijuana or their cocaine or their meth. No, they get it most likely from someone of their own race down the road. Research has shown that drug markets, much like American society generally, are fairly segregated by race. Black folks tend to sell to blacks, whites tend to sell to whites, Latinos to each other. Drug markets are even segregated by class. College and university students sell to each other. Drug dealing happens in every community of all color, but those who do time for drug crime are overwhelmingly black and brown. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been one race, African American. Now, I find that when I show people the data, they usually say, yeah, that's bad, that's a shame, but, you know, we've got to wage a drug war in those communities because that's where the violent offenders are, that's where the drug kingpins are. We've got to get tough with them. In fact, in my experience, most people seem to imagine that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. And in fact, I believed that myself for quite some time. But it's not true. It's not true. The current drug war was declared by President Ronald Reagan in 1982 at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. It was before, not after, crack began to ravage inner-city communities and become a media sensation. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term, a war on drugs, but President Ronald Reagan turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared his drug war, drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise, and less than 3% of the American population even identified drugs as the nation's most pressing concern. So why declare a war on drugs, when drug crime's actually on the decline, not on the rise, and less than 3% of the American population views it as their most pressing concern? Well, from the outset, the war on drugs had relatively little to do with genuine concern about drug addiction or drug abuse, and nearly everything to do with politics, racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were anxious about, threatened by, fearful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Now, to be fair, I think we have got to acknowledge that it was poor and working class whites who really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. You know, wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer, But poor and working class white folks who themselves were struggling for survival, they were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids who might suddenly be forced to be bused across town to attend a school they believed was inferior. It was their kids and themselves who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for limited jobs with this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And to make matters worse, affirmative action programs created the impression that black folks were now leapfrogging over them on their way to Harvard or Yale or fancy jobs in corporate America. And this state of affairs created an enormous amount of fear, anxiety, resentment, but it also created an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group not so subtly defined by race, could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class white voters to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he described the strategy as, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. Well, they did. They did. A couple years after crack hit the streets and began to ravage inner-city communities, the Reagan administration hired staff whose job it was to feed those stories to the media in the hopes of turning crack into a media sensation, bolstering public support for a drug war they had already declared. And soon, politicians began competing with each other to pass harsh mandatory minimum sentences for minor drug crimes, sentences harsher than murderers receive in other Western democracies. And soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. And it was the Clinton administration that championed laws banning drug offenders from federal financial aid for schooling upon their release, banning drug offenders from public housing based even on arrest records, even if they hadn't been convicted, making them ineligible for public housing. It was the Clinton administration that championed a federal law banning drug offenders from food stamps for the rest of their lives. To a large extent, many of the rules, policies, and practices that now constitute the basic architecture of this new caste system was championed by a Democratic administration, desperate to win back those so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. But still, so many people, even who know this history, will say, but what do we do about all those violent offenders and those drug kingpins we imagine living in ghetto communities? What people don't realize is this drug war has never been focused primarily on rooting out violent offenders or drug kingpins. Federal funding has flowed in this war to state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer volume of drug arrests. It's been a numbers game. State and local law enforcement agencies get rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of people who are swept into the system for drug offenses, helping to explain why law enforcement officials so often go out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching, pulling as many cars over as possible, searching as many folks as possible on the street. In fact, the New York Police Department reported that in 1 year alone, 2010, the New York Police Department stopped and frisked 600,000 people. In 1 year alone, 600,000 people. 85% of those stops and frisks were of African Americans and Latinos. In less than 15% of those stops and frisks, was there any kind of suspect description or investigation into a criminal case? Hundreds of thousands of people stopped, frisked, searched, without any evidence of criminal activity. How is this possible, you say? How could police stop and frisk folks without any evidence of any criminal activity? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court has actually given the license to the police in the drug war to do precisely that. In a series of cases, the U.S. Supreme Court has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. It used to be that the police had to have some kind of reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or probable cause to stop or search you on the street. Not anymore. The court has ruled that as long as the police get consent, they can stop, frisk, search you anywhere for any reason without any evidence of criminal activity. Now, what's consent? Consent is when a police officer walks up to somebody on the street with one hand on his gun and says, "Son, put your arms up in the air so I can frisk you, see if you got anything on you." And the kid says, "Uh-huh." That's consent. And the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures no longer applies to that interaction. That's how the police are able to get away with sweeping these communities, stopping and searching hundreds of thousands of people without any evidence of criminal activity whatsoever, guaranteeing that thousands of poor folks of color will wind up going to jail for crimes that escape the attention of the police every day. Now, these practices, the police don't do this on college campuses. They don't stop and frisk folks on their way to school, on their way to the dorm room on college campuses. They don't do it in suburban communities. No, they do this almost exclusively in the hood. And it's not they're not arresting in mass people for violent crimes. No, quite to the contrary. The overwhelming majority of people swept into the system in the drug war have been arrested for nonviolent, relatively minor drug offenses. 4 out of 5 drug arrests, in 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests, simple possession. Only 1 out of 5 for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the Clinton years, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful, less addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent, in middle-class, white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But by waging this drug war almost exclusively in the hood, we've created a vast new racial undercaste in an astonishingly short period of time. And the U.S. Supreme Court has made it impossible for us to challenge this system for racial bias. In fact, the lawsuits that I was filing back when I was at the ACLU, challenging racial profiling by law enforcement, challenging patterns and practice of discrimination, can't even file those cases anymore today. The U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. Unless you have evidence of conscious intentional bias, tantamount to an admission by someone in law enforcement, you can't even state a claim of racial bias in the criminal justice system today. But again, being trapped behind bars, being swept in, is just the beginning. Because once you're released, for many, the punishment truly begins. You find that you're subject to legal discrimination for the rest of your life in employment. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box on employment applications asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And it doesn't matter if that felony happened a few weeks ago or 35 years ago. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box, knowing full well the odds are sky high that application's going straight to the trash. Hundreds of professional licenses are off limits to people convicted of felonies. In fact, in my state, in Ohio, you can't even get a license to be a barber if you've been convicted of a felony. People say, well, come on, at least they could get a job at McDonald's. Getting a job at McDonald's is no easy feat if you have a felony record. Housing discrimination, perfectly legal. Public housing projects, as well as private landlords, perfectly free to discriminate against people with criminal records. Even arrest records can lock you out of housing. Discrimination in public benefits perfectly illegal. As I mentioned earlier, under federal law, you're deemed ineligible even for food stamps for the rest of your life if you've been convicted of a drug felony. Fortunately, many states have now opted out of this ban on food stamps for drug offenses, but it remains the case that thousands of people can't even get food stamps when they're released from prison because they were once caught with drugs. What do we expect folks to do? You're released from prison, can't get a job, you're barred from housing, even food stamps may be off limits to you. Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, which continues to accrue while you're in prison, and in a growing number of states, you're actually expected to pay back the costs of your imprisonment. And then get this, if you're lucky enough to get a job right out of prison, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, up to 100%. What do we expect folks to do? Say, what does this system seem designed to do? Seems designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what, in fact, happens the vast majority of the time. About 70% of people released from prison return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return in some states do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. So what do we do? What do we do about this? Why have we chosen this path? Why have we chosen to recreate this vast new system of racial and social control that locks people into a permanent second-class status? Well, I think one thing is clear. In the years following Dr. King's death, we as a nation were faced with a choice. We could continue down the road Dr. King was traveling. We could choose the path of compassion, forgiveness, inclusion, and hope. Or we could choose another path, a path more familiar when it comes to matters of race. It's the path of exclusion, division, punitiveness, and despair. One day, I believe historians will look back and they will say it was there, right there at the prison gates, that we abandoned Dr. King's dream and took a dramatic U-turn that would wind up locking up and locking out millions of Americans in a shockingly familiar way. We have now spent $1 trillion waging the drug war. $1 trillion. Funds that could have been used for education, for job creation in the communities that needed it most. Funds that could have been used to promote our collective well-being. Instead, those dollars paved the way for the destruction of countless lives, families, and dreams. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. And if you doubt that's the case, if you think something less will do, that we can tinker with this system and reform it somewhat and get back on the right path, consider this. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s or the early 1980s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Private prison companies, now listed on the New York Stock Exchange, would be forced to watch their profits vanish. This system is now so deeply rooted in our political, social, and economic structure that it's not going to just fade away without some kind of major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know there's many people who say today that there's really no hope of ending mass incarceration. All we can do is try to tinker with this system. and minimize some of the damage it causes. So many people are resigned to this system, just as folks were once resigned to Jim Crow in the South, saying, oh, it's a shame. Yeah, but that's just the way that it is. So many people today view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails today as just an unfortunate but inalterable fact of American life. Well, I'm confident that Dr. King and Ella Baker and Sojourner Truth would not have been so easily deterred. So we have got to be willing to take up the baton and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to shelter, the right to quality education, without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King and all those who risked their lives to end the old Jim Crow, I hope we will commit ourselves to building a human rights movement for education, not incarceration, for jobs, not jails, a human rights movement that will end all these forms of discrimination against people released from prison that deny them basic human rights to work, to shelter, and to food. So how do we begin this movement? Well, first, I think we begin by telling the truth, the whole truth. We've got to be willing to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to recreate a caste-like system in America. We've got to be willing to tell this truth in our schools, in our churches, our places of worship, and our mosques. We've got to be willing to tell this truth out loud so we can awaken and actually see what we've been blind to for so long. But simply consciousness raising and truth telling isn't going to end this system. We've got to be willing to do more. So I believe we've also got to be willing to build an underground railroad for people returning home from prison, people making a genuine break for freedom. We've got to be willing to open our schools, open our churches, open our places of worship, our community centers to people returning home from prison, helping them find employment, shelter, food, love. We've got to be willing to support the families of those who have loved ones behind bars and create safe spaces where people feel welcome and supported rather than shamed and blamed and stigmatized. Now, how do we create those safe places? Well, I think first, we've got to be willing to admit our own criminality out loud. Our own. Because the truth is, we're all criminals. We're all sinners. We've all made mistakes in our lives. People tell me, oh, don't call me a criminal, really. I'm not a criminal. Don't call me a criminal. I'm like, okay. Well, maybe you never drank underage. Maybe you never experimented with drugs. Well, if the worst thing you've ever done in your whole adult life is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you've put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of their living room. But there are people in the United States serving life sentences for first-time drug offenses. Life sentences. In a case called Harmland versus Michigan, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a life sentence imposed on a young man for a first-time drug offense does not violate the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment, even though virtually no other country in the world does such a thing. So we've got to stop ending this sense that the criminals are them, not us, and instead say, there but for the grace of God go I. After all, Barack Obama himself has admitted to using marijuana and cocaine in his youth, quite a bit of it, in fact. And if he hadn't been raised in Hawaii, and if his drug use hadn't occurred on predominantly white college campuses, if he had been raised in the hood, he would have been stopped, he would have been frisked, he would have been searched, and far from being president of the United States today, he might not even have the right to vote in some states. He might be cycling in and out of prison and jail with the rest of them. This isn't about them and us. This is about all of us, building a movement on behalf of all of us, recognizing that all of us have made some mistakes in our lives, but only some of us are paying for those mistakes for the rest of our lives. But simply opening our arms isn't enough either, because just as in the days of slavery, it wasn't enough to build an underground railroad and shuttle a few to freedom with open arms, today, it's not enough just to help a few. We've got to be willing to work for abolition, for an end to the system of mass incarceration as a whole. And what does that mean? It means ending the war on drugs, ending it completely. We've spent $1 trillion, destroyed millions of families and lives, and yet rates of drug addiction and drug abuse remain largely unchanged. We've got to end it. We've got to shift to a public health model for dealing with drug abuse and drug addiction. We've got to end all these forms of discrimination that lock people into a permanent second-class status and deny them basic human rights upon their release from prison. And we've got to shift from this purely punitive approach to dealing with violence in our communities to a more rehabilitative and restorative approach, one that takes into account the needs and concerns of the victims, the community, and the offender. Now, this may sound like too much. We've got to end mandatory minimum sentences, end stop and frisk practices, end all these forms of discrimination. It may seem overwhelming, like it's too much. And if it feels that way to you, just keep in mind that all of these rules, laws, policies, and practices rest on one core belief. And it's the same belief that sustained Jim Crow. It's the belief that some of us, are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, and concern. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to fall like dominoes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born, one that takes seriously the dignity and humanity of all people. And yes, it's got to be multiracial and multi-ethnic. Because although this war on drugs was born with black folks in mind, it is a war that has destroyed the lives of people and communities of all colors. Here in Minnesota, there are more white folks locked up than folks of color. So many of those folks are suffering today because of a get tough movement born of our nation's racial divisions and anxieties. A white kid today who's getting a prison sentence rather than the drug treatment he needs but cannot afford is suffering because of a drug war born with black folks in mind. And we see the same racially divisive politics that birthed the drug war leading to a new prison building boom in the United States today, this one aimed at suspected illegal immigrants. So we have got to be willing to connect the dots and build a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement on behalf of all of us. But before this work can even get underway, before this movement can truly be born, a great awakening is required. We have got to awaken from our colorblind slumber to the realities of race in America. And we've got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals, not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the basic dignity and humanity of all people that has formed the sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration and not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Thank you so much for having me. I'd be happy to take your questions.